the problem of speaking after Mr. Eistad is that he's said all the cool stuff, and I've torn up everything that I wrote and wrote something new in order to avoid boring you. Apparently the same rules still apply. If you're bored, put your hand up. If you want coffee, don't put your hand up, because then you'll make me feel bad that you're bored. So just wait for the coffee to come. It is an enormous privilege to be here today. There are slides, but we can ignore them for the most part. It's a great privilege to be here today, partly because it's 25 years, almost to the day, since I first came to get involved in the energy industry in India. And during that time, nobody has got any older. Atul Chandra is as ageless as he was then. Many others have similarly shown signs. So whatever it is you're eating, whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it. And I hope that I'm going to take some of that back with me, because I don't seem to see the same person in the mirror that I originally saw. That experience, though, set me up for joining Cambridge Energy Research Associates, became part of IHS. Jaron now is going to hate me because he didn't know that until this moment. And ultimately moving to the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Centre, which is a bit of a mouthful. CAPSARC is what it's better known as. In the same way as ONGC rebranding, CAPSARC is a name that allows us to talk about energy in general rather than just petroleum. And in looking at that, what we see is this world of increasing transition. And I'm going to try and just touch on a few key points as they relate to the oil business, because the oil business seems to be in the crosshairs of the transition movement. And I think several people have alluded, we've been in a stage of transition for ages. We consume more biomass today than at any time in history, even though we've been transitioning away from wood for 400 years. We consume practically more coal than we've ever consumed in history, depending on whether China just ups or downs by 2 or 3%, despite transitioning away from coal for about a century or so. We consume more oil, we consume more natural gas. In fact, we consume more of everything, more energy in general. The only way of reducing the amount of energy that a nation consumes is to have a recession, or to grow very slowly. Now, a recession is obviously a bad idea. Europe has tried that for about a decade, and as an experiment, it hasn't been hugely successful. So they've decided to go back to growing again and make the challenge of reducing energy demand tougher. But slow growth is still not as great as it could be. And so having tried that experiment, a few nations are going to try moving to something different, decarbonization. What does that mean? Well, the first thing it means is that we're talking about peak demand. If we think about how often the term peak oil was mentioned a decade ago, it was always in the context of peak supply. Now it's mentioned in terms of peak demand, and we're at the sort of peak of discussion of peak demand. Everyone is talking about it so much that maybe it's time the market is turning. And we see that in the sense, and maybe I can use my teenage son as an example. Hopefully this is off the record, because he'll kill me if he hears me talking about his love life in this way. He discovered an important message that I think many politicians could do with understanding. When he had a girlfriend and he said to her while they were at the cinema, about halfway through the movie, he said, "I think we're probably going to break up in 6 months' time." And he discovered that he had just broken up with her at that moment. She got up and walked out of the cinema. And what's going on in the oil business isn't far different. We've got lots of politicians telling oil producers, we're going to break up with you in 20 years' time. But please keep investing hundreds of billions of dollars a year in our relationship until eventually I find someone better. That's not a recipe for stability and a lack of volatility. And what have we seen over the course of the last 4 or 5 years? It is that we only need to have a difference between demand and supply of 1 or 2% to change the oil price by 50% down, or 100% up. And if we think about how long the lead times are and how small those imbalances are, we end up understanding that we can't afford to have uncertainty about whether we're going to continue to want to consume oil, whether we're going to want to continue to consume gas. And other than a few people in this room, I think the majority don't care so much about coal. But coal, let's face it, is still an enormous part of the mix, so we should probably care about it. So I want to talk about three things. One is underinvestment. How much underinvestment have we really had? Are we investing enough or not? The second is oil market rebalancing and trying to understand how we rebalance oil markets. And then finally, I want to talk about volatility and the role of OPEC in addressing volatility. Now, these are subjects that Jared has touched on, but I want to just go into a little bit more depth. The first is underinvestment. Actually, maybe I will use one of the slides that I had, because it might just... yeah, here we go. So if you think about what we heard for the last couple of years, what we heard was the world is underinvesting by $300 billion a year. And that was because we had global capital expenditure in oil and gas upstream of about $700 billion a year in 2014. And we saw global capital expenditure coming down to about $400 billion a year in 2016, 2017. Now, that first thing is that a big chunk of that was expenditures on non-associated gas. So we have to take that off firstly. And so that takes us down in 2014 to about 540. The second thing is, again, costs came down. We went from a full cycle marginal cost of supply. We saw service companies being obliterated. I think, again, Jared had a fantastic slide of the top 450. I would have had a question, what happened? Not all of those 450 still exist, or at least maybe there were more and there are only 450 left. But what we saw was tremendous cost deflation. The next thing we saw, of course, is that we must have been over-investing to have built up that imbalance where we had too much oil in storage. So we have to take that off. That's the money that was going into just growing inventories. And when we compare 2017 to 2014, what we find is that the underspend is only about $70 billion a year. Isn't it great being able to say only $70 billion a year? When most of the people in this room were young, $70 billion was a lot of money. But the point about it is that we can swing back up fairly quickly. In fact, if we look at what happens with CapEx, it swings wildly, just lagging behind the oil price. It just goes to show that all of those strategic planning departments that you have in your companies are completely a waste of time. All you need to do is just look at what the oil price is and a year later react, and then you'll be in line with the market. Or at least if they are delivering value, it's not delivering a lot of foresight. Or maybe it is. If we look at how the forecast production profile of developments starting in two windows, one was 2012 to 2014, the other was 2015 to 2017, and then we've just rebased them back to the same start year. What you see is that the oil price can change by $60 a barrel, and the production profile really doesn't change an awful lot going forward. There's tremendous momentum built up. Maybe that's an argument against strategic planning departments, because there's so much momentum in the system that they really don't make any difference. You just keep investing as much as you're earning and hope to be able to sell it. In the end, it doesn't actually matter, because what's driving the global oil market is what's demand going to be and what's demand in the short term and how are we going to meet that. And that is where the rebalancing comes in. Oil demand has been growing tremendously strongly because prices dropped. Oil demand slowed down because prices went up to a point at which people found it cheaper to consume other commodities. Markets matter. Apparently not in India, because politicians think that they can override markets, but markets matter. There are three, off the top of my head, great injustices that I can think of in terms of branding, in terms of public reputation. Ostriches. Ostriches do not stick their heads in the sand. But every ostrich that I've ever met, the number one thing on their mind is, God, I hope he's not going to think I'm one of these ostriches that sticks my head in the sand. And I've met a lot of ostriches. They just lie down and lie their necks along in the long grass. They lie them on the ground. Bad PR. They need David Attenborough or someone to come and give them a better reputation. Lemmings are not suicidal. That film that we probably all saw when we were young of lemmings jumping off a cliff, that was filmmakers driving them off a cliff. King Canute. Hopefully some of you have heard of King Canute. His reputation was destroyed by a historian saying, oh yes, he thought he was so powerful that he could hold back the tide. No, King Canute did the opposite. King Canute was trying to illustrate how even a king cannot hold back the tide. So he went and sat below high water and the tide came in and he said, you see, I'm not that powerful. Turns out being a king who's not that powerful isn't good for your long-term job prospects. Didn't do him any good. But the key point is, why am I talking about ostriches, lemmings, King Canute? Markets are the tide. And if there is a politician who thinks that they are powerful enough to withstand markets over the long term, then honestly you're going to get your feet wet. Now, I'll come back to why that matters for India specifically, and particularly why, if you want to know what the gas market in India is going to look like, go to Argentina. Okay? Argentina, blessed with some of the best resources, some of the best footballers, but unfortunately, Argentinian politicians. The possibilities of making a mistake on that level matters to India, and maybe it'll be in the after lunch session that we can talk a little bit more about that. But the reason I want to talk about why markets matter and why no one can withstand them is OPEC. There's this wonderful narrative. OPEC is no more powerful than a tweet from the US president. We think about it for a few minutes and then we say, nah. OPEC cannot overcome market forces. If they set the price too high, if they target the price too high, the market makes a fool of them by overproducing until eventually OPEC can't hold the price up. When the market price is too low, there's not enough investment and the market makes a fool of them and the price comes up. So OPEC's actually pretty humble. It has one overriding objective, which is market stability. It looks to make sure that the market is adequately supplied at whatever price is going to create roughly a balance. The problem is we only know whether it's the right price with the benefit of hindsight, because I can reassure you, if anyone knew what the right price was with the benefit of foresight, with the greatest of respect, Narendra Pai, they would not be at the World Energy Policy Summit. They would be on an island in the Maldives, maybe tuning in by satellite link, but they wouldn't be working for a living if they had that kind of foresight. What OPEC does is it tries to reduce volatility. Now, we did some research at CAPSARC recently, and I'm happy to share the paper with anybody. It was published in the Energy Journal, that identified that between $150 and $200 billion of value was added to the global economy every year as a result of the reduction in volatility that OPEC creates in the oil price. Spare capacity is a really cheap way of reducing volatility. It's a much cheaper way of doing it than creating inventories. But we worry about inventories far more than we worry about spare capacity in terms of setting the short-term oil price. And the rebalancing that we're looking for is for excess inventories to be brought down. If you think about what inventories do today, then you realize that we need every barrel that we've got in inventory, because we need it to be in the right place. We need it to be instantly available, and we need it often in the right grade. And we've moved from a point at which global inventories were designed and positioned for a market where we knew where the oil was going to flow. It was going to flow out of the Middle East, and it was going to flow into Asia. We were going to see oil flowing into America. Now we've got inventories that have to tolerate the fact that oil's flowing out of America. Products are flowing. We're trading more products than ever before. We've got more different grades of things. So inventories need to be large. They're not what's relevant to setting the oil price over the cycle. It's the level of capital investment and it's the level of spare capacity. And If we then think about what does that mean in terms of the transition, we need to have an open mind. In fact, I was very impressed when Senator Moret talked about pragmatism and realism being more important than ideology. I truly hope that he's persuaded many other politicians in Europe who do seem to be a little more on the ideology end of the spectrum. But we've come a long way since George W. Bush's, I think, iconic joke about the problem with the French is they have no word for entrepreneur. I think he knew exactly what he was saying at the time, where in fact France has moved. If we think about the reputation of the French economy 20 years ago compared to the reputation of the French economy today, it has moved. It has become pragmatic. It's become entrepreneurial. It has taken a leading position, and it pains me to say, as an Englishman, that the French economy is far more entrepreneurial than the British economy is. But we'll see to fixing that. It is certainly the case that if we're going to manage the transition, it's going to require not just technical entrepreneurialism, it's going to require policy entrepreneurialism. It's going to require a faith in markets that says we may think we know better when we're in policy positions, but we should be reading the market every day and listening to its advice and making sure that we use market solutions to achieve the transition rather than purely trying to override with ideological solutions. And why does that matter? It matters because politicians focus on price. Even yesterday when President Trump said, get the price down. Price isn't what matters to the global economy, it's cost. Because price compared to cost is just a redistribution of money. High prices mean that there is more rent going to the producer of the good. Low prices means there's more consumer surplus going to the consumer of the good. But the overall global economy, when you calculate GDP, it doesn't care about the redistribution. It only cares about the value added, the underlying difference between the cost of the good and the value, the consumer surplus that it creates. If we are not careful, we will have policies that cause the cost of energy to be higher because we produce energy less economically efficiently, and we will have slower growing economies. And here in India, more than anywhere else in the world, we recognize that the number one priority, not just for us, but for our grandchildren, is to increase the welfare of society by increasing the income that people have to spend, which allows them to invest in education and all those other things. There's one statistic that sticks with me every day when I think about the job that we try to do at CAPSUC, which is about trying to find frameworks to make energy available to people at the lowest possible cost. It is that the average IQ of a community after the introduction of formal energy, dispatchable energy, electric power, compared to before, is 10 points. If you think about how much economic value is created by adding 10 points to the IQ of the average IQ of the population, imagine if every American had an IQ 10 points higher, how much higher their GDP would be. It's easier to imagine when you add it to a large number, whereas if you're thinking about a much poorer society, it's hard to think of things. But just imagine if every American had 10 points higher IQ, we'd be talking about trillions of dollars of extra GDP. We'd be talking about trillions of dollars of extra welfare. It is creating the base of that increased welfare that will allow future generations, with the addition of pragmatism and entrepreneurialism, to solve the problems that we see today as so intractable, and to make sure that we do indeed have a bright energy future, one that I know we all aspire to. Thank you.